As a result of these glaring failures of the optimistic narrative, the digital dream of renewing democratic citizenship has been challenged and partly overshadowed in the course of the last 10 years by a digital nightmare of undermining democratic citizenship by short-circuiting reasoned deliberation, by nurturing conspiracy theories, by intensifying polarization, and incubating extremism.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Robin Fleming. I'm a professor of history here at Boston College. It's a great pleasure to introduce Rogers Brubaker. He's written more than a half a dozen books, all of which, in one way or another, wrestle with issues of identity. In recent years, his work has focused on a number of burning issues, and his careful argumentation and clarity have helped us think through the rise in the contemporary world of populist movements and of a variety of trans identities, especially transgender and transracial identities. And his work unpicks the practices and contestations around them. Even more recently, he's begun to focus on the social transformations wrought by hyperconnectivity. So please join me in welcoming Professor Brubaker.
It seems hard to believe today, but from the 1980s through the middle of the last decade, digital connectivity seemed to be full of democratic promise. The new ecology, it was thought, would promote more participatory forms of citizenship. It would bring previously excluded or marginal groups into the polity, and it would contribute to undermining authoritarian regimes. The story got many elements right. Citizenship has indeed become more participatory as ordinary citizens have joined public conversations in new ways and in unprecedented numbers. Social media and messaging apps, by facilitating lateral communication and lowering the cost of coordination, have enabled new forms of what two social scientists have called connective action, and they've fostered new kinds of horizontal social movements. They've made it easier for previously marginalized groups to be seen and heard, and new forms of bottom-up surveillance enabled by the ubiquity of mobile connected cameras have made some actions of public authorities more visible and more accountable. Yet since the middle of the last decade, it has become glaringly evident that the optimistic narrative got other things badly wrong. Instead of making politics more transparent, hyperconnectivity has fragmented the public sphere and made politics more opaque, non-transparent, and largely unregulated techniques of digital influence, from AI-augmented micro-targeting and automated message generation to algorithmic amplification, have spread from commerce into political communication. Encrypted messenger services have allowed political campaigns, especially in the developing world, to spread rumors and mobilize fears while avoiding public accountability, a trend now being amplified by emerging uses of generative AI. Opaque and proprietary algorithms determine who sees what, and private platforms regulate who can say what. Both developments contribute to privatizing the public sphere. In an extreme instance of such privatization, Twitter has become a megaphone for the world's richest man to amplify materials from the darkest corners of the internet to his 200 million plus putative followers, including, of course, the highest reaches of the Trump administration. As a result of these glaring failures of the optimistic narrative, the digital dream of renewing democratic citizenship has been challenged and partly overshadowed in the course of the last 10 years by a digital nightmare of undermining democratic citizenship by short-circuiting reasoned deliberation, by nurturing conspiracy theories, by intensifying polarization and incubating extremism. And authoritarian regimes, even if they were initially unprepared for the nimbleness and creativity of digitally mediated opposition movements, have long since learned to monitor and counter such movements. The most sophisticated such regimes, led by China, have entrenched their power through massively enhanced capacities for digital surveillance. So today, hyperconnectivity seems more likely to authoritarianize democratic regimes, including our own, than to democratize authoritarian regimes. Now, digital nightmares can be just as seductive and just as distorting as digital dreams. So I want to resist the temptation to replace digital boosterism with digital doomsterism, and the temptation to blame hyperconnectivity and social media in particular for all contemporary political ills. It's not that I want to offer a more optimistic account. Far from it. The digital nightmare I just alluded to is one I suffer from myself, and it seems to me to be alarmingly well-grounded in reality. But still, I do want to step back from such totalizing characterizations in order to provide a more differentiated account. And I'll do so under three headings: by considering transformations of what I will call regimes of knowing, regimes of feeling, and regimes of governing. By regimes of knowing, I mean the ways people acquire politically relevant knowledge, or what they take to be knowledge, and the stances they take toward public knowledge claims. And my argument is that hyperconnectivity strengthens populist stances toward knowledge and erodes the foundations of a shared public world. By regimes of feeling, I mean the ways feelings are patterned by socio-technical environments and governed by the feeling rules, I borrow here Arlie Hochschild's phrase, that legitimize certain ways of expressing feelings. And I will argue that hyperconnectivity encourages and rewards the mobilization and expression of moral outrage and thereby contributes to what political scientists have called affective polarization. And by regimes of governing, I mean the new modes of governance that are based on predictive machine learning models and generative AI. I will argue that these technologies have transformed the exercise of power by public agencies and private platforms, not least by enabling the fully automated exercise of power. I'll conclude by considering the tension between these technocratic modes of governance and the more populist regimes of knowing and feeling that are fostered by hyperconnectivity. Let me start with regimes of knowing. Epistemic issues have become increasingly central to the study of politics in recent years. What do I mean by epistemic issues? I mean concerns about truth and falsehood, about science and expertise, and about misinformation and conspiracy theories. Such issues have also become increasingly central to political debates and struggles themselves. Claims have proliferated about fake news, about what science tells us, about what the experts got wrong. Political struggles concern not just who gets what or who is what, but who knows what or who believes what. That is, the politics of interest and the politics of identity are increasingly bound up with the politics of knowledge. The emerging regime of hyperconnectivity initially inspired epistemic optimism. It encouraged people to think of politically relevant knowledge, as of knowledge in general, in terms of discrete bits of information. Information would be abundant, easily discoverable, universally accessible, and the flow of information would be lateral, not simply vertical. Citizens would be empowered to produce and disseminate as well as to consume information. The free flow of information would make politics more transparent, citizens better informed, and governments more responsive. Even as this view came to seem hopelessly naive, the focus on discrete bits of information remained. Only now the emphasis was on the abundant and unimpeded flow of misinformation. Discussions of misinformation intensified during the pandemic, and they reached a fever pitch in the aftermath of the 2020 election. But I want to address a different question, namely how the ecology of digital hyperconnectivity has reshaped ways of knowing the public world by reinforcing suspicion and distrust and eroding the foundations of a shared public world. I want to emphasize that hyperconnectivity is not solely or even primarily responsible for these developments. The decline of deference, the suspicion of expert judgment, the valorization of lay expertise, all of these have a long history, especially in the US. But digital hyperconnectivity has intensified and accelerated these developments. I want to highlight three features of the epistemic environment of hyperconnectivity that I'm going to call abundance, flatness, and immediacy. So by abundance, I mean not only the abundance of information or misinformation, but also the abundance of conflicting knowledge claims. By flatness, I mean that knowledge claims of the most varied provenance, unfiltered by gatekeepers, jostle side by side for our attention and assent on what feels like, or what can feel like, a relatively unstructured playing field. Now, the digital public sphere is, of course, not, in fact, a level playing field. There are enormous differences in the ability to make one's voice heard. But the openness of the digital environment means that all knowledge claims, along with all other digital content, flow through the same conduits and circulate in a decontextualized manner. And this, I would argue, exerts a homogenizing, leveling effect. It places the wildest and most implausible claims on the same plane and in the same frame as those generated by established institutions. And by immediacy, finally, this is the third term after abundance and flatness, by immediacy, I mean the sense of having institutionally unmediated direct access to information. Though, of course, access to information is not, in fact, unmediated, but rather is technologically mediated, right? Algorithmically mediated. Abundance alters not just what we know, but also how we know it or how we think we know it. It alters our relation or stance toward knowledge claims by exposing us continuously to a welter of conflicting knowledge claims, claims that in a flat knowledge space appear to be on the same plane. Digital abundance tends to inculcate a stance of generalized doubt, suspicion, and distrust. It thereby contributes to the weakening of the authority of the institutions that produce and disseminate public knowledge. Journalism, in particular, universities, science as well. This mood of heightened distrust, then, can engender a generalized skepticism toward public knowledge claims. Abundance can also be wielded as a weapon. In a flat knowledge space, and in the absence of trusted intermediaries, abundance can be enlisted as a deliberate strategy of distraction and obfuscation. It can be a means of producing resignation, cynicism, and a sense of disempowerment, as Zeynep Tufekci has argued. The instrumentalization of abundance need not aim to persuade. It may aim simply to overwhelm. This strategy is epitomized in Steve Bannon's famous dictum from 2018 that the way to deal with the media, the real enemy in his view, is to, quote, flood the zone with shit. And generative AI makes it easier than ever to flood the zone. The result may be a paralyzing, demobilizing sense, and here I quote Tufekci again, that the truth is simply unknowable. The strategy of flooding the zone, of course, is not restricted to digital communication or to the politics of knowledge. As we've seen in the first year of the new administration, it's a more generalized, more general political strategy that may overwhelm, disorient, and paralyze the opposition. But here I want to stick with the question of how digitally mediated abundance, flatness, and immediacy have transformed ways of knowing. And I want to emphasize in this connection that hyperconnectivity does not uniformly erode epistemic trust. Distrust in traditional institutionalized media may go hand in hand with trust in less institutionalized sources of knowledge or in alternative epistemic communities. In an environment of seemingly immediate access to information and knowledge, abundance can heighten confidence in individuals' own judgment, including their judgment about which public knowledge claims to trust. And it can thereby contribute to what has been called epistemic hubris, that is, to unwarranted confidence in one's own beliefs about policy-related matters. So what I'm arguing is that the sense of immediacy can work against the disorienting effects of abundance and flatness. Individuals may feel that they enjoy immediate access not only to an abundance of information, but to an abundance of evidence or proof that they may understand as validating or invalidating particular public knowledge claims. So abundance in connection with immediacy can thus be polarizing rather than paralyzing. It can produce contending certainties as those who already hold strong views hew to them even more strongly, seeing their own views as abundantly confirmed and opposing views as abundantly discredited. Hyperconnectivity has made it much easier for us to inhabit radically differing public worlds. The fragmentation of the public world, of course, is not new. Mid-20th century systems of mass communication had supported a widely shared public world, but the binding power of that world had been weakened long before digital hyperconnectivity. So, for example, in the US, it had been weakened by the proliferation of talk radio and cable news channels. Still, the proliferation of rival epistemic, moral, and political worlds has been carried much further in an environment of digital hyperconnectivity. And epistemic polarization has been democratized. The flood of hyper-accessible digital evidence and the ease of sharing and discussing it have made polarization, as it were, more participatory. The abundance, structural flatness, and anti-institutional immediacy of the digital environment have strengthened both epistemic individualism and epistemic populism. They've strengthened epistemic individualism by seemingly making it easier to think for oneself or to, quote, do the research. They've strengthened epistemic populism by heightening popular skepticism of the complex and opaque workings of mainstream knowledge-producing institutions and increasing access to and interest in forms of so-called counter-knowledge that challenge established bodies of knowledge. In both ways, hyperconnectivity has further undermined the cultural authority and deference once enjoyed by mainstream knowledge-producing and knowledge-disseminating institutions. In so doing, it has contributed to the proliferation of competing public worlds, and it has provided a robust robust infrastructure for constructing and maintaining such worlds, an infrastructure that facilitates the production and circulation of a seemingly limitless supply of engaging, compelling, world-sustaining, and world-building content. Now, one additional feature of the knowledge environment of hyperconnectivity, already mentioned in passing, has become particularly pronounced in the last couple of years. And this is, of course, the power of generative AI to create completely convincing synthetic text, images, audio, and in the last year, video as well. So-called deep fakes are already being deployed in political struggles, and the ability to produce them easily and cheaply will substantially undermine, indeed it already has substantially undermined, the integrity of digital evidence, which has further aggravated the forms of epistemic disarray that I've just described. And one has the sense that the use of cell phone videos to successfully challenge the instant lies of administration officials after the killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy in Minneapolis might not even be possible a few years down the road. In an epistemic environment more deeply mediated and even constituted by generative AI, there might be no way to convincingly establish the so-called ground truth of the shootings, as the New York Times was able to do in its remarkable analyses of the video evidence in those cases. I turn now to transformations of regimes of feeling. Just as hyperconnectivity initially inspired epistemic optimism, so too, under the influence of the Arab Spring and the Occupy movements, it inspired optimism about the mobilization of feeling. Manuel Castell's hopeful account of the horizontal and participatory social movements enabled by digital networks pivoted on the mobilization of affect. So did Zizi Papakarisi's equally hopeful account of so-called affective publics, which focused on processes of what she called affective attunement on Twitter that allowed people to feel their way into a developing story. Since the middle of the last decade, however, hyperconnectivity has come to be associated with strong negative emotions, especially with hatred, contempt, anger, and fear, and with affective discord rather than affective attunement. I want to focus here on the mobilization of what social psychologists call moral outrage, directed against those who are seen as violating some kind of moral, social, or political norm. Now, what those norms are and what counts as a violation are, of course, deeply contested. I want to be clear that moral outrage is an ambivalent emotion. It's not always politically toxic. It may be desirable in many contexts, including, of course, the present. It may be necessary. It can mobilize people by focusing attention and emotional energy on something that is perceived as intolerable or unjust and channeling action toward remedying it. But the outrage I'm concerned with here, even though it's articulated and justified in moral terms, is directed against members of a political outgroup, and it's associated with the other condemning emotions of anger, contempt, and disgust. It's also associated with a desire to hold others accountable or to punish them, and it shades over easily into abuse and harassment. When harassment is sparked by moral outrage, it's often felt to be justified. The mobilization of outrage against political opponents is, of course, not new. Outrage has been a strategy for capturing attention since the early days of mass circulation newspapers more than a century ago. And it was broadcast media that made the mobilization of outrage a recognizable and reliably profitable genre, central to the business model of conservative talk radio in the 1990s and of Fox News in the 2000s. But digital hyperconnectivity has supercharged the production and circulation of moral outrage for three reasons. First, it's by now a truism that the algorithms that govern the circulation of digital content are optimized for engagement. And moral outrage is distinctively, though of course not uniquely, engaging. It captures attention both because of its moral framework, since moral stimuli are more attention-getting, and because of its intense emotionality. Content producers, therefore, have incentives to generate content that expresses outrage. Incentives to produce engaging content, of course, long precede hyperconnectivity, but techniques for monitoring and measuring attention and for optimizing content for engagement have become vastly more sophisticated in the last decade or so. And the ubiquitous user-facing metrics of social media platforms channel individual contributions in the same direction. Secondly, the superabundance of digital content provides an inexhaustible reservoir of material for anyone seeking to mobilize moral outrage. Much commentary has highlighted the role of fake news or misinformation in fueling outrage. But purveyors of outrage need not resort to fabrication. In the hyper-integrated, easily searchable digital media space of a very large country like this one, there's never any shortage of real material, news stories, documents, tweets, TikToks, and so on, that non-trivial segments of the population will find outrageous. Now, this is obviously not to deny the importance of misinformation in the digital public sphere, but it is to argue that the outrage machine does not depend on wholesale invention, even if it does depend on taking things out of context or on selective quotation or tendentious reframing. Thirdly, digital communication networks have democratized the production and circulation of moral outrage, just as they have democratized the production of polarized public knowledge. Outrage is no longer simply mobilized from above, it's co-produced from below. One-click convenience enables frictionless participation in ongoing digitally mediated expressions of moral outrage, whether by signing an online petition or commenting on, retweeting, sharing, or liking others' expressions of outrage. Initiating a chain of outrage is equally convenient and frictionless. The costs of expressing outrage have plummeted, both because the time and effort required are negligible and because the digital remove from the target reduces the emotional costs of expressing outrage. It's a lot easier to express outrage in a digitally mediated context than it is face-to-face. And the threshold for what is deemed outrageous has declined, allowing for the proliferation of forms of micro-outrage. Social media networks not only reduce the costs of expressing moral outrage, they provide new benefits for doing so. They assemble audiences for anyone wishing to broadcast, and they provide immediate, quantified, and highly gratifying social feedback. They therefore provide the perfect environment for what philosophers have called moral grandstanding, that is, for audience-directed moral talk that seeks to enhance one's status within a group or a network. And just as anyone can become a digital micro-celebrity, so anyone can have their own grandstand, since moral grandstanding, like micro-celebrityhood, is defined not by the numbers of followers one has, but rather by the fact that one is performing for an audience, whatever its size. Digitally amplified outrage exacerbates polarization. It contributes, more specifically, to reinforcing affective polarization, defined by antipathy toward the opposing party. The irony is that social media intensifies polarization in an important part by exaggerating its extent. So let me explain what I mean by that. By contributing to what political scientists have called false polarization, social media end up contributing to real polarization. More precisely, by contributing to false ideological polarization, social media contribute to real affective polarization. How does this happen? The voices of outrage on social media platforms are amplified and thereby contribute to an exaggerated picture of polarization by three factors. The first is our tendency to pay attention to moral and emotional stimuli, as I just mentioned. when scanning a social media feed. The second, which I've also noted, is the fact that algorithms boost the circulation of engaging material. And the third is the fact that people who post frequently on political topics are more partisan, more polarized, more inclined to outrage than others. So the amplified voices of outrage not only drown out other people, they drive out other people as more quiet and moderate voices, alienated by what can become a toxic atmosphere, drop out of the discussion. So social media, therefore, can yield a distorted picture of the actual distribution of political views, a picture that represents the public as more deeply divided and more clustered toward the extremes than it actually is. To moderate partisans, this makes the opposing party seem even more extreme and more threatening, and it can thereby increase antipathy toward that party. So misrepresentations of the degree of polarization can themselves be polarizing and can, in that sense, become self-fulfilling. Okay, having discussed transformations of regimes of knowing and regimes of feeling, I turn now to regimes of governing. The new ways of governing are, in many ways, antithetical to the new ways of knowing and feeling. If the new ways of knowing and feeling are deeply politicized, the new modes of governing seem at first to be strikingly depoliticized. And if the new regimes of knowing and feeling can be described as populist and participatory, the new regimes of governing are most easily seen as technocratic. Technologies of digital governance are changing very rapidly, and the academic literature inevitably lags behind. The main social science literature on new modes of governance has focused on predictive machine learning systems that extract patterns from historical data and use those patterns to predict outcomes of interest in new cases. Such predictive algorithms have been used, for example, to inform sentencing, bail, and parole decisions in the criminal justice system. They've been used to flag children at risk of abuse in social service settings. They've been used to guide the deployment of police resources. They've been used to focus scarce regulatory enforcement resources on cases that are algorithmically deemed most likely to involve violations. But the newer generative AI systems, by contrast, are used to produce rather than to predict. Now, it's true that the large language models that underlie applications like ChatGPT operate internally by predicting the next token in a sequence, but they are deployed not to forecast outcomes, but to generate stuff, to generate texts, images, videos, code, and other artifacts. These artifacts then enter into social, cultural, political, and administrative processes, imparting a recursive dynamic to generative AI. Now, recursivity or reflexivity has long been a central theme of social theory. Sociological theories and economic models become part of the world that they analyze, but generative AI accelerates, automates, and dramatically amplifies this reflexive dynamic. Commentators on algorithmic governance have identified three fundamental tensions surrounding the use of predictive models in governance contexts: tensions between claims of objectivity and counterclaims of bias, tensions between the opacity of predictive models and the transparency and accountability required by democratic governance, and finally, tensions between the automaticity of some algorithmic decision systems and human agency and autonomy. All three of these tensions are further sharpened by the use of generative AI systems. I want to say a few words about the third tension. At present, most predictive machine learning systems generate recommendations, leaving humans to make the decision. So the algorithmic classification or prediction is one thing, the human intervention is another thing. But as algorithms become more powerful and more sophisticated, they encroach on the space for discretion. Even when algorithms nominally only recommend courses of action, it may become increasingly difficult in practice for humans to override them. So as algorithmic systems become more autonomous, humans risk becoming less so. But it's not just the agency and autonomy of bureaucratic decision makers that are eroded. It's the agency and autonomy of the governed. Automated forms of AI-driven governance are distinctive in being potentially self-enforcing. This is especially true in the realm of digitally mediated social action. And as more and more of social life becomes digitally mediated, the field of potentially fully automated, self-enforcing governance expands dramatically. As Ori Schwartz, a young Israeli sociologist, has argued, self-enforcing systems of algorithmic governance do not work by establishing rules and then specifying penalties if you violate the rules. Rather, the fact of digital mediation enables these systems to preempt violations altogether. And this transforms the nature of power, which is now generative rather than regulative. Power can directly produce social reality and govern people's conduct from the outside rather than seeking to influence their will by threatening, for example, a punishment if you violate a rule, rather than seeking to influence their will and consciousness. So an example of this, digital platforms can directly govern the activities of their users through the design and control of the digital architectures that determine what can be done on the platform. So gig workers' accounts can be automatically deactivated if their rating falls below a certain level. Right? That's totally automatic. It requires no human agency. Or digital control systems could allow a car to be remotely disabled if the owner falls behind on payments. That's just possible because of these systems of digital mediation. So Schwartz developed this argument about the generative rather than regulative nature of digitally mediated power before the takeoff of generative AI. Deactivating a gig worker's account or remotely disabling a vehicle works only in tightly structured digital environments, and it relies on simple rule-based triggers when certain threshold is crossed. But generative systems, the more recent systems, by contrast, operate in less structured environments. They can interpret complex inputs and generate responses. In emerging so-called agentic systems, for example, they can also initiate actions that go beyond communicative utterances and trigger or execute operations outside the model itself. And this capacity for interpretation in an unstructured environment and autonomous action vastly expands the scope of self-enforcing so-called generative power beyond those examples I gave earlier. One key site for increasingly automated, self-enforcing digital governance is content moderation on digital platforms. Even before the takeoff of generative AI, the superabundance of digital content drove demand for automated moderation. There's just too much content to do it any other way. Generative AI, though, has greatly amplified the problem of abundance, right? Because you can produce new content, so much of it on such a vast scale, and thereby it has made the demand for automation more urgent. Moderation continues to rely heavily on the older class of predictive models that classify content by estimating the likelihood that it violates platform policies, but generative AI systems are increasingly involved as well. They are used to interpret posts in their context, right? To pick up on contextual cues, to analyze multimodal posts. That means posts that combine text, images, video, audio. They're used to detect tone or stance, such as sarcasm, They're used to generate explanations of moderation decisions to users. So this is a whole new kind of automated content moderation. When we think of content moderation, we usually think of removing objectionable content, but moderation is more fundamentally about regulating the circulation of content, deciding what gets amplified or slowed down or made visible. As Tarleton Gillespie has argued, presenting users with a feed of relevant and engaging material is itself a form of moderation, and one that is constitutive of what platforms do. Through moderation, in this broader sense, platforms govern not only who is allowed to say what, but perhaps even more fundamentally, they govern who is likely to see what, and therefore, in some measure, who is likely to know what or believe what and who feels what. So here, regimes of knowing, regimes of feeling, and regimes of governing all come together. Private platforms, in this sense, have become centrally involved in governing public life, wielding concentrated, opaque, and largely unaccountable power over all of public communication. The modes of AI-driven governance exercised by the great tech platforms are vastly more sophisticated than anything in the public sector. This is not surprising because they have the data and the AI expertise and the money. But an immense gap is an immense opportunity, especially at the present moment. The present administration's demonstrated readiness to move fast and break things provides an extraordinary opportunity to implant tech platforms at the data-rich heart of the infrastructure of public governance. So for tech companies, this is an extraordinary chance to pitch private solutions for problems of public governance. The technological solutionism that Yevgeny Morozov skewered brilliantly a decade ago pales in scope and scale by comparison to the solutionism that is on the near horizon. Close cooperation between public agencies and private platforms in the era of big data is, of course, not new. And the blurring of the lines between public and private has been a theme of political and social theory for half a century. But our accelerationist moment, an accelerationism that is both politically and technologically conditioned, means that the corporate reconstruction of the state, the deeper transformation in statecraft itself, and the private appropriation of public data that Marion Fourcade and Jeff Gordon warned of in a prescient article from a few years ago are poised for a great leap forward. But in addition to the private appropriation of public data, we also see the reverse, the public appropriation of private data on an unprecedented scale. On the one hand, we see governmental appropriation of data that was previously normatively private, that is, protected by norms or laws from use outside of certain specific contexts, such as IRS taxpayer data, which have recently been made available to immigration authorities. On the other hand, we see the infrastructural groundwork being prepared for frictionless governmental exploitation of data that was previously functionally private. And what I mean by that is that it was protected from such exploitation by being siloed in hundreds of separate databases. Attempts at cross-database integration are not new, but they were greatly accelerated by DOGE in the first months of the new administration, and they have subsequently been driven further by ICE. The technocratic quality of the new regimes of AI-mediated governance is sharply opposed to the populist, participatory, and politicized character of the new regimes of knowing and feeling. So I want to conclude with some broader remarks about the ways in which the same digital infrastructures that encourage populist modes of knowing and feeling also enable technocratic modes of governing. Digital hyperconnectivity accentuates the chronic populism of late modern societies in two main ways. First, it's a technology and an ideology of immediacy. By circumventing or disrupting institutional intermediaries of all kinds, hyperconnectivity promises to connect people directly to news and information, to connect audiences directly to creators, to connect citizens directly to political leaders. Now, complete disintermediation is, of course, a myth. Hyperconnectivity simply replaces one kind of intermediary, a visible institutional intermediary, with self-invisibilizing intermediaries, namely digital platforms. But digital platforms do remain intermediaries even when they disavow that role and present themselves instead as neutral conduits and facilitators. But the promise of immediacy is not illusory, not entirely illusory at any rate. The bypassing or weakening of existing intermediaries is very real, and it's important. Digitally mediated connections can feel direct and immediate, and President Trump's connection with his 100 million Twitter followers during his first term was, in fact, more direct and immediate than the usual institutionally mediated and filtered connections between politicians and citizens. And citizens' relation to public knowledge claims, even though it's filtered by algorithms of large language models, is indeed more immediate than it was when public knowledge was organized, let's say, by the three major American television networks or by a single state broadcaster in some other countries. The ideology of disintermediation, cutting out the middleman, is powerfully attractive, and is precisely a populist ideology. For populism is itself an ideology of immediacy, one that promises to empower ordinary people by disempowering mediating institutions and the elites that are benefiting from them. In the political sphere, populism delegitimizes political parties, professional expertise, universities, courts, and the mainstream media. All of these are institutional mediators. Populism delegitimizes these and demands instead an immediate or direct relation between the people and the exercise of power. So there's a deep similarity, a structural similarity between the logic of digital hyperconnectivity as a technology of disintermediation and the logic of populism as an ideology of immediacy. Hyperconnectivity delivers, in a sense, part of what populism demands. It bypasses or weakens mediating institutions and connects people directly, or at least seems to connect them directly, to news and information, to cultural products, and to political leaders. The second way hyperconnectivity fosters populism is by contributing to the popularization of culture and politics. And there are three aspects to this, which I'll briefly mention. One is the opening up of more accessible and engaging forms of participation, cultural and political participation, and the consequent broadening of the range of participants. Digital platforms have made it much easier for those outside the cultural or political mainstream, including the disaffected citizens to whom populist politicians often appeal, to find like-minded others and establish a public presence. A second aspect of popularization is that hyperconnectivity has made calculations of popularity more central to culture and to politics. Techniques of continuous and granular quantification make popular preferences and beliefs visible in new ways. Ubiquitous trending algorithms, for example, do not simply register what is popular for a particular public at a particular time. They amplify and reinforce the very popularity that they register. The digitally networked spaces, the digitally networked public sphere, thus enshrines popularity as the ultimate arbiter of value. And hyperconnectivity contributes to popularization in a final sense by strongly favoring popular cultural and political styles, that is, low styles rather than high or elevated styles. Low styles are attention-seeking and taboo-breaking. They flout the constraints and restraints of polite speech and political correctness. They incline toward confrontation, emotionalization, personalization, hypersimplification. This kind of low style was, of course, already favored in the pre-digital mediatization of politics in the age of television, but they are even more strongly favored in the highly competitive digital attention economy and in what I call the attention polity. They have the best chance, that is, these low styles have the best chance of gaining traction by breaking through the glut of superabundant digital content. So the ecology of digital communication has deep affinities with the logic of populism. In the cultural domain, it erodes the power of gatekeepers, it engenders new forms of popular creativity, it universalizes metrics that both record and amplify popularity. And in the political sphere, it allows ordinary people, disaffected citizens in particular, to be addressed directly. It facilitates the emergence of counter-publics, and it rewards the low political styles that are best suited to mobilizing against the establishment. But at the same time, the modes of algorithmic and AI-mediated governance enabled by infrastructures of connectivity are deeply technocratic. They are premised on specialized technical knowledge, the knowledge generated by complex computational procedures that analyze immense volumes of data. Technocratic ideals also underlie and animate the broader spirit of technological solutionism that I mentioned a moment ago. Solutionist thinking, like technocracy in general, is depoliticizing. It seeks to transform social and political problems into technical problems, exemplifying what Michael Oakeshott called the assimilation of politics to engineering. So technocracy and populism are usually understood as opposites. While technocracy entrusts decision-making powers to experts or expert-designed knowledge procedures like algorithms or AI systems, populism distrusts the claims of expertise in politics. And while technocracy is depoliticizing, seeking to insulate decision-making from popular interference, populism is generally repoliticizing. It claims to reassert political control over issues that are seen as having been illegitimately removed from the domain of democratic decision-making and entrusted to unaccountable bureaucrats or experts or courts. As decision-making by unaccountable algorithms and AI systems becomes increasingly important, one might, therefore, expect it to become similarly vulnerable to populist challenge, especially if generative AI causes massive white-collar job losses. But as Christopher Bickerton and Carlo Invernizzi-Accetti have argued, and I'm going to end with this, the reciprocal antagonism of populism and technocracy conceals an underlying affinity. Both are opposed to the complex and messy institutional mediations of party democracy. As the structural foundations for party democracy have eroded in the last half-century, political competition has come to be structured increasingly by what they call a techno-populist logic, characterized by conjoined appeals to the people on the one hand and to problem-solving competence on the other. Now, Bickerton and Invernizzi-Accetti are not concerned with new communication technologies. The techno, in their term techno-populism, refers to technocracy, not to technology. But universal digital mediation reinforces the synthesis of populism and technocracy that they describe. As a technology and ideology of immediacy, digital hyperconnectivity exacerbates the very crisis of institutional mediation to which it claims to respond. It contributes, in particular, to the hollowing out of key mediating institutions, the parties, the press, increasingly universities as well. And as a technology of the popular, digital mediation generates new ways of mobilizing, consulting, and measuring the people, and new ways of claiming to act on their behalf. as a technology, finally, of knowledge, digital mediation and AI afford new ways of knowing and governing the social world, new ways of recasting social problems as technical problems. So if techno-populist appeals to the people and to expertise increasingly structure our politics and shape our experience of democracy, as Bickerton and Invernetzi Chetty argue in the final sentence of their book, our infrastructures of digital communication increasingly structure and shape both appeals to the people and appeals to expertise. So the techno in the term technopopulism may indeed refer to technology as well as technocracy. Thank you.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you for the talk. It was amazing. You had spoken about how hyperconnectivity promises to connect people, and ideally, without mediation, it wouldn't, I guess, disrupt the connection between people like the masses and then people in power. But then you brought up another point, which is that the ideology of disintermediation is also populist because it seeks to disempower institutions in the same way that it promises to create a direct connection between like the masses and then people in power. Do you think there is a balance between mediation that has to be sought? And then if so, like where do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, I'm an institutionalist, but I'm an old, irrelevant person now, and we're living in an age in which mediating institutions are challenged on all fronts, right? I think that's one of the interesting aspects of this subject is that they're challenged both by the digital technology and by the political mood, right? By populist, nobody likes institutions, right? And it's easy to see why. Institutions are opaque, they're complicated. It's hard to understand their inner workings unless you've spent a lot of time in an institution, right? And you're told, how do they work? They depend on trust, right? So, much of our political life depends on trust. And then in a context in which trust has eroded, then, institutions are extremely vulnerable. So universities, for example, it's astonishing how small a fraction of the American public says they trust universities. And that's not just Republicans, right? So our institutions are extremely fragile and extremely vulnerable, and it doesn't help that there's this kind of pincer movement, right? Institutions being eroded by socio-technical developments on the one hand, and the reservoirs of trust and deference that used to sustain them on the other hand. So the depletion of those reservoirs of trust. So it's a very difficult moment for institutions. So I don't know if the question is really how do we find a balance, but how do we find new sources of support for institutions? How do we recreate institutions? How do we make institutions more robust at a time where they are so weak, so fragile, so much on the defensive? That's a very, very difficult project. I have some ideas about universities, but this is not just universities, right? How do you recreate forms of journalism that are more widely trusted? How do you recreate political parties that are trusted? Right? Our complex system of liberal democracy was long thought to rest on this network of complex mediating institutions, including things like parties, churches, universities, expert systems, science, et cetera. All of those institutional spheres have been weakened.
Thank you so much for this very thoughtful and ambitious set of concepts and talks. One thing that was running throughout it that I wanted to sort of bring you back to is the way in which the disintegration of the news media and journalism over the course of several decades could be pretty essential to both regimes of knowing and regimes of feeling. On one hand, you have massive and widespread loss of newspapers, magazines, layoffs, news deserts, and it's that void from which these kind of new regimes of knowing that you describe, I think, can take shape. Secondly, regimes of feeling. Journalism used to have objectivity as an ideal, and over the course of several decades, the kind of opinionization of news content has been taken root and indulged in a way that would not have been true in previous generations when it comes to journalistic norms. So I'm just curious if you think that the sort of decline of the American news media has a sort of central role as a culprit in some of these regimes taking shape.
Absolutely, no question about that. I would only make just a couple of nuances to your observations. The objectivity thing, it's not like journalism was always, right? That was a historical achievement at a particular moment, and really a late one, right? Only mid-20th century. Previous, turn of the 20th century, the ideal of journalistic objectivity wouldn't have made sense to anyone, right? So at a particular moment, that developed professional news organizations, started developing notions of autonomy, objectivity, specific professional ethics, and so on. So that only lasted about half a century. But yes, absolutely, it's a huge change when that declined. On the decline of newspapers, I would particularly emphasize the decline of local newspapers, and that is just the complete decimation. So what does that mean? It means in part not only the opinionization of news, but the nationalization of news. And why does that matter? It's because now all news, all politics is national politics. Local newspapers used to sustain a kind of local politics where people knew more about it, right? They didn't just have opinions. They knew some of the people involved. They knew some of the things that local governments were doing. They knew something about the issues. Whereas now everybody's doing the game of national politics all the time, and that indeed induces a new kind of regime of feeling. So yes, I think you're absolutely right that the disintegration of the news media, as you put it, or the transformations of news media are absolutely central to this story thing.
My question is, what gives you hope?
Well, this is a very complicated question. This talk was not about personal uses of digital technology, but let me answer the question that way because I have now, a couple of kids who are thinking about having kids, and one of them actually, for a long time, he himself never had a smartphone, no social media since 10th grade or something. But he felt, how could he become a father? Because kids going to be born umbilically connected, to digital stream, and how could he communicate with this? But he got over that hump, and I think it's easier to do so now because I do think that in the domain of kids and tech, I think kids have wised up. I think they've there's a sense that they know that they were sold a bad bargain, right? That they are stuck in some kind of communication system, which they don't want to opt out of on their own, because of course that's social death, but which they would like not to exist. And so, people like Jonathan Haidt, who's been extraordinarily successful in being the right man with the right message at the right moment in calling for things like, no phones in schools and that kind of, or a strict age limits on. So, I think, and these proposals, like almost nothing else in our public life now, have bipartisan support. They've been adopted in red states and blue states. And if something like that is done on the level of a school, then the kid doesn't have to do it themselves, right? Then, now, of course, that doesn't mean there won't be phones outside of school. So, but if there's really an enforceable system that you can't get an Instagram account until you're 16, then if nobody can do it, then you're not left out, right? So I do have some hope about the kind of a shifting public stance towards the information ecology, the digital information ecology that has kind of polluted the technology. This is a technology that produces persons, right? It shapes persons and it shapes persons according to the priorities of maximizing engagement. On that's not a good way to bring up a generation of kids. So I think there's signs of change in that domain. I'll mention one other thing in the more public domain. I'm not sure I believe this, but I thought it was an interesting argument. So there's a philosopher, Dan Williams, read an article of his yesterday suggesting that generative AI, unlike social media, may actually be what he calls a convergent technology. That is, may lead people's visions of the public world to be more similar to one another than this vision of kind of social media where everyone has a different vision of the world. Why? Because the systems, the large language models that underlie all the ChatGPT, even the one produced by Elon Musk, which is supposed to be less woke, but it's really not that different, right? If you ask Grok, that's Musk's large language model, a question about a complicated, it's going to give you an answer that's really pretty simple, similar to what you will get if you ask ChatGPT or Claude, something like that. So he feels that there's some possibility that these, I mean, there are all kinds of problems with generative AI, don't get me wrong, and we could, that's grounds for pessimism on all kinds of fronts, but maybe some aspects of that will, undercut the dynamic of epistemic hyperpolarization that I discussed.
Please join me once more in thanking Professor Brubaker.
Thank you.